According to virtually all the accounts that can be read, this was essentially a spontaneous, organic response to the war in Southeast Asia and to the prevailing social conditions of the time. Conspiracy theorists, of course, have frequently opined that what began as a legitimate movement was at some point co-opted and undermined by intelligence operations such as COINTELPRO. Entire books, for example, have been written examining how presumably virtuous musical artists were subjected to FBI harassment and/or whacked by the CIA. Here we will, as you may have already ascertained, take a decidedly different approach. The question that we will be tackling is a more deeply troubling one. What if the musicians themselves and various other leaders and founders of the movement were every bit as much a part of the intelligence community as the people who were supposedly harassing them? What if, in other words, the entire youth culture of the 1960s was created not as a grassroots challenge to the status quo, but as a cynical exercise in discrediting and marginalizing the budding anti-war movement and creating a fake opposition that could be easily controlled and led astray? And what if the harassment these folks were subjected to was largely a stage-managed show designed to give the leaders of the counterculture some much-needed street cred? What if, in reality, they were pretty much all playing on the same team? It should probably be mentioned here that, contrary to popular opinion, the hippie flower child movement was not synonymous with the anti-war movement. As time passed, there was, to be sure, a fair amount of overlap between the two movements. And as the mass media outlets, as is their wont, did their very best to portray the flower power generation as the torchbearers of the anti-war movement. After all, a ragtag band of unwashed, drug-fueled longhairs sporting flowers and peace symbols was far easier to marginalize than, say, a bunch of respected college professors and their concerned students. The reality, however, is that the anti-war movement was already well underway before the first aspiring hippie arrived in Laurel Canyon. The first Vietnam War teach-in was held on the campus of the University of Michigan in March of 1965. The first organized walk on Washington occurred just a few weeks later. Needless to say, there were no hippies in attendance at either event. Not to worry, that problem would soon be rectified. And the anti-war crowd, those who were serious about ending the bloodshed in Vietnam anyway, would be none too appreciative. As Barry Miles has written in his coffee book table Hippie, there were some hippies involved in anti-war protests, particularly after the police riot in Chicago in 1968, when so many people got injured. But on the whole, the movement activists looked on hippies with disdain. Peter Coyote, narrating the documentary Hippies on the History Channel, added that some on the left even theorized that the hippies were the end result of a plot by the CIA to neutralize the anti-war movement with LSD, turning the potential protesters into self-absorbed navel-gazers. An exasperated Abby Hoffman once described the scene as he remembered it thusly, quote, "There were all these activists, you know, Berkeley, radicals, White Panthers, all trying to stop the war and change things for the better. Then we got flooded with all these flower children who were into drugs and sex. Where the hell did the hippies come from? As it turns out, they came, initially at least, from a rather private, isolated, largely self-contained neighborhood in Los Angeles known as Laurel Canyon."